Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. Imagine a city that by every ordinary measure should never have existed at all. A city with almost no land worth mentioning, no rich farmland, no mines, no forests close at hand, no great army marching at its command. A city built not on firm earth, but on mud, marsh and salt water. A city rising out of a desolate lagoon, where the tides shifted, the winds cut across the flats, and the ground itself seemed too uncertain to trust. By all logic, such a place should have remained a scattering of huts, a temporary refuge at best, and then disappeared into the sea. And yet for 1,000 years this impossible place became one of the richest, most resilient, and most admired states in the world. It became the gateway between East and West, a republic of merchants that grew into a maritime empire. This is the story of Venice, and like all the best stories, it begins not with triumph, but with fear. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Post your location and local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The beginning of Venice was not planned by dreamers or drawn by architects. No king pointed to the lagoon and declared that a glorious city should rise there. No empire designed it as a proud capital. Venice began as a place of refuge, a place people ran to when everything else around them was collapsing. In the 5th century after Christ, the Western Roman Empire was coming apart. The old order, which had once stretched from Britain to North Africa, was cracking under pressure from every side. Roads still ran across the land, cities still stood, villas still glittered in the sun. But the confidence that had sustained Roman civilization for centuries was failing. Northern Italy, prosperous and deeply tied to the Roman world, found itself exposed to the violence of invasion and war. The security that had seemed permanent suddenly looked fragile. Then came the shock that made the danger impossible to ignore. From the east rode the Huns, terrifying to those who faced them, swift and destructive, led in legend and memory by Attila. Their advance sent waves of panic through the region. Cities were threatened, fields devastated, settlements abandoned. The Roman population of the northeast, the people known as the Veneti, did what frightened human beings have often done when the world catches fire around them. They fled. They did not flee to a mountain fortress or a walled stronghold. They fled to the one place cavalry could not easily follow, the broad and confusing lagoon along the Adriatic coast. It was not a beautiful sanctuary then. It was not the Venice of paintings and postcards, of marble facades reflected in quiet canals. It was a hostile landscape, a maze of mudflats, salt marshes, reeds, shallow channels, and low islands that shifted with the weather and the tide. It smelled of salt and wet earth. It was exposed, uncomfortable, and poor. But it possessed one priceless advantage that mattered more than comfort or elegance. It was difficult to attack. A mounted army that could thunder across the plains of Italy was nearly useless in that watery labyrinth. The shallow waters, hidden sandbanks, and twisting channels formed a natural defence more effective than many walls. So the first Venetians were not conquerors, they were refugees. They were people who had lost homes, possessions, certainty, and the ordinary shape of life. They were fishermen, farmers, salt workers, families who had escaped with what they could carry and found themselves forced to begin again in a place that seemed barely habitable. It is one of history's quieter ironies that one of Europe's greatest powers began as an act of desperation. Those early communities did not have the luxury of romance. They had to survive. They learned how to live with brackish water, with tides, with storms, with isolation. Their new settlements rose on small islands and muddy banks, and everything about daily life had to be adapted to the demands of the lagoon. There would be no easy road systems, no wagons rolling over packed earth from one quarter to another. Water defined movement, work, and time. Boats were not accessories in such a world. They were necessity itself. Yet surviving there demanded more than courage. It demanded invention. The great question was simple and merciless. How do you build anything lasting in mud? How do you raise houses, churches, storehouses and quays when the ground beneath you seems eager to swallow them? The answer the Venetians devised was one of the most ingenious pieces of practical engineering in medieval history. They drove long, sharpened wooden piles deep down through the soft mud, thousands upon thousands of them. The piles were forced through the unstable layers above until they reached hard-packed clay beneath. This produced something like an underwater forest, dense and tightly set, creating a stable base where none had existed before. On top of these pilings, the builders laid thick timber platforms. Only then could stone foundations be placed above, and only then could real structures begin to rise. Venice, in the most literal sense, was built on an upside-down forest. Its beauty would one day seem effortless to visitors, but beneath every palace and church lay an enormous invisible labour of timber, mud, and patience. There is something revealing in that method. Venice was not founded through a grand gesture, but through repetition. One pile after another, one platform after another, one practical solution after another. It was the work of people who did not have the luxury of purity or elegance. They had to make the impossible functional before it could ever become magnificent. The lagoon also transformed the character of those who lived there. Geography does more than shape cities. It shapes habits, expectations, and ways of thinking. In Venice, the environment taught lessons every day. The residents learned to be adaptable because rigid thinking breaks quickly in a place ruled by water. They learned to value skill over appearance because survival in the lagoon rewarded competence, not boasting. They learned to be wary because safety depended on understanding hidden channels and changing conditions. Above all, they learned to orient their lives toward the sea. Their roads were canals, their carts were boats. Their livelihoods increasingly were tied not to fields but to waterborne exchange, fishing, transport and salt. Salt mattered enormously. It preserved food, sustained trade, and became one of the first foundations of wealth in the lagoon communities. In that early world, salt was not a seasoning but a strategic resource. The sea provided it, and the people of the lagoon knew how to harvest it. Even before Venice became a queen of long-distance commerce, it was learning how profit could be drawn from water itself. This mattered because it meant the lagoon was not just a hiding place. It could become an economic environment. At first, the settlements were little more than clusters of survival, but over time they gained permanence. Wooden structures became more substantial. Religious life took root. Trade between islands increased. Connections with the mainland, though dangerous, were never entirely severed. The refugees did not remain merely fugitives from history. Slowly, almost stubbornly, they began to create a new world. And what a peculiar world it was! Most medieval communities were defined by the land around them, its crops, roads, fortifications, and fields. Venice was defined by absence. It had almost none of that. This absence, rather than crippling the city, forced it toward a different destiny. It had little reason to become a conventional feudal society. No broad-landed aristocracy could easily dominate the marsh islands in the way noble families dominated inland territories. The lagoon did not naturally produce mounted knights, castle lords, or large agricultural estates. It produced boatmen, traders, craftsmen, pilots, sailors, and people who understood movement better than possession. That distinction helps explain why Venice developed so differently from much of medieval Europe. While inland powers looked to fields and castles, the lagoon communities looked outward, toward channels, coastal routes, and the sea beyond. The sea was not an edge to them. It was the centre. It was protection, path, pantry, and possibility all at once. In those early centuries, life was still harsh. The lagoon was no paradise, and the people living there would have known that better than anyone. Water had to be managed. Disease was a danger. Storms could destroy work in a single night. Supplies from outside remained important, yet hardship has a way of training communities in realism. Venice was born without illusions. It did not inherit an ancient myth of itself as chosen or glorious. It had to justify itself day by day. That realism became one of its lasting strengths. Venice would later cloak itself in splendid ritual, in gold mosaics, processions, diplomatic ceremony, and symbols of majesty. But underneath all of that ceremony lay the older character of a refugee settlement that had survived because it learned how to solve problems. Even in its most glamorous centuries, Venice remained at heart one of history's great practical civilizations. And perhaps that is the real wonder of its origin. Not merely that people built on mud, but that they learned to treat weakness as a beginning. They had no broad territory, so they mastered connection. They had no easy defences, so they used confusion and water as weapons. They had no abundant natural resources, so they developed skill, trade, and engineering. What seemed like disadvantage after disadvantage slowly hardened into a distinctive strength. As the decades passed, the scattered settlements of the lagoon became more cohesive. They were still shaped by danger, still influenced by the wider upheavals of Italy and the remnants of Roman authority, but something new was forming. Out of fear came community. Out of instability came improvisation. Out of mud came structure. A people who had once fled into the marshes to survive were beginning to realize that the lagoon did not merely shelter them from the world, it gave them a strange and powerful position within it. For between the collapsing world of the West and the wealthier, older centers of power in the East, the lagoon stood in a place of possibility. The refugees and fishermen who had once huddled among reeds and shifting islands could not have known it yet, but they were laying the foundations for a city that would one day bargain with emperors, command fleets, shape crusades, and dominate trade routes stretching across the Mediterranean. Before Venice became magnificent, it became necessary. Before it became proud, it became stubborn. Before it ruled the sea, it learned how not to drown in it. The city born from panic and salt water was not destined to remain a humble refuge forever. The same lagoon that protected it had also transformed it. It had produced a people unlike the feudal powers around them, restless, disciplined, adaptive, and increasingly drawn toward maritime life. In time, the settlements would need more than endurance. They would need order, leadership, and a political system strong enough to hold together a growing and ambitious community. The people of the lagoon had escaped tyrants on land. The question now was whether they could build a state without becoming the very thing they had fled. As the scattered settlements of the lagoon slowly grew into a single community, a new challenge emerged, one that was less dramatic than fleeing from invading armies, but in the long run just as important. The early Venetians had learned how to survive in the marshes. They had learned how to build on mud, how to travel through the maze of channels, and how to make the lagoon itself serve as a defense. But survival alone was not enough. If their fragile society was to endure, they needed order. They needed a system of leadership strong enough to unite the islands, yet careful enough not to destroy the freedom they had fled to the lagoon to preserve. The refugees who had built Venice had escaped a world dominated by strongmen. Across the mainland of Italy, power was increasingly falling into the hands of warlords, feudal lords, and military leaders who ruled through force and inheritance. The memory of Roman administration had faded, replaced by a patchwork of petty rulers, each guarding his own territory and ambition. The people of the lagoon understood this danger well. Their families had fled from the violence and instability that came with such rule. The last thing they wanted was to recreate the same system within their fragile new home. Yet a community without leadership cannot function for long. Trade needed coordination. Disputes required arbitration. Defense had to be organized. The settlements that dotted the lagoon could not remain isolated villages forever. Gradually, necessity forced them to develop a political structure that could hold them together. In the early centuries, Venice remained loosely tied to the Byzantine Empire. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, The eastern half of the Roman world continued to survive from its magnificent capital at Constantinople. The Byzantine emperors still considered much of Italy part of their realm, and the Lagoon communities were technically under their authority. But distance is a powerful force in politics. Constantinople was hundreds of miles away across mountains and sea, and the emperors had many other problems closer to home. In practice, the Venetians governed themselves. Over time, a position emerged that would define Venetian politics for nearly 1,000 years. This was the office of the Doge. The title itself came from the Latin word dux, meaning leader. The choice of the title was deliberate and revealing. The Doge was meant to guide the city, not dominate it. He was to be a leader, but not a king. A representative of the state, but not the owner of it. The first Doge was established in the 8th century, when the Lagoon communities realized they needed a single figure who could represent them both internally and in dealings with foreign powers. But the Venetians approached the idea of leadership with deep caution. They were determined that no Doge would ever become a monarch in disguise. From the beginning, the office was carefully constrained. The Doge was elected, not born into power. His position was granted by the leading families of the city, and although he served for life, his authority was balanced by numerous institutions designed to limit his influence. Venice was constructing something unusual in medieval Europe, a state built on the careful management of power rather than the concentration of it. At the centre of this system stood the Great Council. The Great Council was composed of members from the noble families of Venice, the wealthy merchant houses whose fortunes were tied to trade across the Adriatic and beyond. These families formed the backbone of Venetian society. Their wealth did not come from owning vast estates, but from commerce ships, cargo, contracts and connections stretching across the Mediterranean. This merchant elite understood something fundamental about their city's future. Stability was more valuable than glory. Trade requires predictability. Merchants cannot thrive in a world constantly shaken by civil war, coups or dynastic struggles. If Venice was to prosper, its political system had to prevent the rise of ambitious tyrants who might gamble the city's fortunes for personal power. So the Venetians designed a government that was, in many ways, suspicious by design. The Great Council acted as the supreme authority of the state. It elected the officials who ran the various institutions of the Republic. It controlled legislation, administration, and the structure of the government itself. From its ranks came the members of smaller councils that managed daily affairs. The system was complex, layered, and intentionally cautious. Even the Doge, the most visible figure of the Republic, lived under strict limitations. When a new Doge took office, he swore an elaborate oath known as the Promissione Ducale. This oath listed in detail the restrictions placed upon him. He could not appoint his own successor. He could not allow his sons to hold important public offices during his reign. He could not leave the city without permission from the councils. Even his personal correspondence was monitored. Letters addressed to the Doge were often opened and reviewed by state officials before he could read them. To modern observers, such measures might seem excessive, even paranoid. But for the Venetians, they were essential safeguards. Their entire system was built on the idea that concentrated power was dangerous. No individual, however capable, could be trusted completely. Perhaps the most famous and feared institution within this structure was the Council of Ten. The Council of Ten was created as a special committee responsible for protecting the state from internal threats. Its purpose was simple but ominous: to uncover conspiracies, treason and plots against the Republic. The council operated with extraordinary secrecy and authority. It could investigate citizens, question suspects, and impose severe punishments if it believed the stability of the state was at risk. Its presence reminded everyone in Venice that loyalty to the Republic was not merely an expectation, it was a requirement. One of the most striking symbols of this culture of vigilance could be found carved into the walls of buildings across the city. These were the famous Bocche di Leone, or lions' mouths stone letterboxes shaped like the face of a lion. Citizens could slip anonymous accusations into these slots, reporting suspected corruption, treason, or misconduct. The accusations were reviewed by officials and sometimes triggered investigations. This system created an atmosphere that balanced cooperation with caution. Venice was a society where public order and stability mattered deeply, but where the state also watched its citizens carefully. Yet remarkably, this intricate web of councils, checks, and suspicions worked. While much of medieval Europe experienced frequent political turmoil, kings battling rivals, nobles rebelling against their rulers, dynasties rising and collapsing, Venice remained comparatively stable. The system did not eliminate ambition or conflict, but it channeled them into a structure that prevented sudden upheaval. In effect, Venice had built a republic that behaved like a machine. Each part of the government had a role, and no single part could dominate the whole. Power circulated through councils, elections, committees, and procedures that were deliberately complicated. Decisions took time. Authority was shared, monitored, and limited. This complexity was not a flaw. It was the system's greatest strength. The Venetian Republic was not a democracy in the modern sense. Ordinary citizens did not have equal political power. Real authority remained concentrated within the noble merchant families who controlled the councils. But within that elite circle, governance depended on cooperation and balance rather than raw force. The result was something rare in the medieval world: continuity. Year after year, decade after decade, Venice avoided the catastrophic political crises that plagued many other states. Rulers came and went, councils changed members, but the structure itself endured. Stability allowed merchants to plan long-term ventures. It allowed shipbuilders to expand production. It allowed diplomats to negotiate treaties that could last generations. Most importantly, it allowed Venice to focus its energy on what truly defined its identity: trade. The Lagoon had produced a people whose lives were shaped by water and movement. Their city was not surrounded by farmland or defended by massive walls. Its future lay in ships, routes, ports, and exchange. While other states measured power in acres of land or numbers of soldiers, Venice increasingly measured it in cargo, contracts, and commerce. The merchant families who guided the Republic understood this clearly. Their wealth depended on safe sea lanes, reliable partners, and steady political conditions. Every institution of the Venetian state, from the Doge to the Great Council to the secretive Council of Ten, was designed to protect that commercial ecosystem. In a sense, Venice became the world's first great corporate republic. It was governed by merchants who thought in terms of profit, risk, and logistics. Their wars were often fought to protect trade routes. Their diplomacy focused on securing privileges and markets. Their laws reflected the practical concerns of shipping, contracts, and finance. But before Venice could dominate the seas, it still had to navigate a complex relationship with a much older and more powerful empire. For centuries, the Lagoon city had lived in the shadow of Byzantium, the eastern continuation of the Roman world. Constantinople, the glittering imperial capital, was one of the richest and most sophisticated cities on earth. Its influence stretched across the eastern Mediterranean, and Venice was still technically part of its sphere. That connection would shape the young republic profoundly. It would influence its culture, its art, its trade networks, and its ambitions. For a time, Venice would grow strong by serving the Byzantine Empire, but as the centuries passed, that relationship would begin to change. The servants would become partners, and eventually rivals. The Lagoon city that had once been a fragile refuge was beginning to understand its own potential. Its government had found stability, its merchants were gaining experience, its ships were sailing further from home. And beyond the Adriatic, in the shining capital of Constantinople, lay the wealthiest markets in the world. For the first centuries of its existence, Venice lived in the shadow of a far greater power. The Lagoon settlements might have been growing stronger, but they were still small when compared to the immense authority of the Byzantine Empire. From its magnificent capital at Constantinople, the Byzantine emperors ruled over the eastern Mediterranean, commanding armies, fleets, and cities whose wealth had accumulated for centuries. In theory, Venice was simply another distant outpost of this vast imperial world. Yet the relationship between Venice and Byzantium was never simple. Geographically, Venice belonged to the western half of Europe. It sat at the northern edge of the Adriatic Sea, facing the Italian mainland. But culturally and economically, the city increasingly looked eastward. Constantinople was the centre of wealth, luxury, and advanced civilization in the medieval world. Its influence reached across trade routes that connected Europe to the markets of Asia and the Middle East. For the merchants of Venice, that eastern orientation offered opportunities that the fragmented politics of Western Europe could not match. This connection shaped Venice deeply. Visitors entering the city in later centuries could see it immediately in the architecture and decoration of its most important buildings. The shimmering mosaics that covered the interior of St. Mark's Basilica, glowing with gold and intricate imagery, were unmistakably Byzantine in style. Craftsmen trained in the traditions of Constantinople worked in Venice or influenced its artists. The city's visual culture reflected that Eastern heritage. But the connection was not only artistic, it was practical. Venice's growing fleet made it useful to the Byzantine emperors. The empire faced constant pressure from enemies around the Mediterranean, Norman adventurers from the west, Arab fleets from the south, and rival powers eager to chip away at imperial territory. The emperors needed capable naval allies, and Venice's sailors were becoming known for their skill, so an arrangement developed that suited both sides. Venice provided ships and maritime support when the empire required them. In return, the Byzantine court granted the Venetian merchants special privileges in trade. These privileges allowed the city to prosper far beyond what its modest geography would normally allow. The most important moment in this relationship came in the year 1082. At that time, the Byzantine Empire was facing a dangerous threat from Norman forces advancing through the Mediterranean. The emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, needed help quickly. Venetian naval support could mean the difference between holding his territories and losing them. In exchange for that assistance, he issued a decree that would transform Venice's economic future. This decree was known as a Golden Bull. The Golden Bull granted Venetian merchants extraordinary privileges throughout the Byzantine Empire. They were allowed to trade in many imperial ports without paying the taxes that other merchants were required to pay. In some cities, they were given entire districts where they could live, conduct business, and operate warehouses and docks. Constantinople itself, the richest city in Christendom, opened its markets to Venetian traders under these special conditions. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Tax-free trade gave Venetian merchants an enormous advantage over their rivals. Competitors from cities like Genoa and Pisa had to pay duties that increased their costs. Venetian ships could move goods more cheaply and therefore sell them more profitably. Cargo flowed through their hands in ever-growing quantities. Silks, spices, precious metals, fabrics, and luxury goods from the East that were coveted in European markets. Within a generation, the Venetian presence in Constantinople had grown into a powerful commercial community. The city's merchants built docks, warehouses, and homes in the Venetian quarter along the Golden Horn. Ships from the Lagoon arrived regularly, carrying goods from Western Europe and returning with valuable cargo from the East. Venice was no longer just a small maritime town. It was becoming a central node in the trade network, linking the Mediterranean with the wider world. Yet this success contained the seeds of tension. From the Byzantine perspective, the privileges granted to Venice were becoming increasingly problematic. The empire had intended to reward a useful ally, but the arrangement had consequences that were difficult to control. Because Venetian merchants paid little or no tax, enormous amounts of commercial activity were now passing through their hands without contributing revenue to the imperial treasury. The empire was slowly being deprived of income that it badly needed. Meanwhile, the Venetian merchants themselves were becoming wealthier and more confident. Their ships dominated the harbours, their warehouses expanded, their influence grew. What had begun as an alliance between patron and client was beginning to look more like economic domination. In Constantinople, resentment began to build. Local merchants saw their business opportunities shrink as Venetians captured larger shares of trade. Citizens of the city watched wealthy foreigners living comfortably inside privileged districts, while the empire itself struggled with financial pressures. To many Byzantines, the Venetians appeared arrogant and exploitative. Violence occasionally erupted. There were riots and clashes between local populations and the Venetian community. Venetian traders were attacked, and imperial authorities sometimes had to intervene to restore order. The atmosphere grew tense, filled with suspicion and bitterness. For Venice, the situation required careful balance. The Republic benefited enormously from its privileges within the Byzantine world, but it also understood that the empire's goodwill could not be taken for granted. Diplomats worked constantly to preserve favourable relations, even as Venetian merchants pushed their advantage wherever possible. Over time, however, the balance began to shift. Venice continued to grow richer and more powerful. Its fleet expanded, its merchants travelled further, and its political institutions remained stable while many other regions of Europe experienced turmoil. The Byzantine Empire, meanwhile, was facing mounting difficulties, military threats, internal conflicts, and the gradual erosion of its once unquestioned authority. What had once been a relationship between master and subordinate was slowly reversing itself. The Venetians understood the empire's strengths and weaknesses better than most outsiders. After all, they had traded in its ports, served in its fleets, and lived within its capital. They knew the location of its wealth, the structure of its defences, and the vulnerabilities hidden beneath its magnificent appearance. The relationship between Venice and Byzantium was therefore becoming complicated in ways neither side had fully anticipated. Venice still benefited from imperial connections, but it was no longer merely a loyal partner. Its merchants were thinking in terms of competition. Its leaders were learning that economic strength could be translated into political and military influence. By the end of the 12th century, the alliance had cooled considerably. The privileges that had once bound the two powers together were now sources of friction. Venetian merchants continued to dominate trade in Byzantine ports, but the goodwill that had allowed that dominance was fading. Hostility simmered beneath the surface, occasionally erupting into open conflict. In the eyes of many Byzantines, the Venetians had become a dangerous presence within their own empire, and in Venice, a new realization was beginning to form. The Lagoon city that had once depended on Byzantine favour was no longer weak. It possessed a stable government, experienced merchants, and a growing navy capable of projecting power across the Adriatic. The people who had once fled to the marshes for safety were now players in the larger political struggles of the Mediterranean world. But before Venice could fully embrace its independence, it needed something more than ships and wealth. Power in the medieval world was not only measured in armies or gold, it was also expressed through faith, relics, and symbols. Cities competed for sacred prestige just as fiercely as they competed for trade. Rome had the tombs of apostles. Constantinople possessed holy relics gathered from across the Christian world. If Venice wished to stand among the great powers, it needed its own spiritual foundation. And so the leaders of the city began to think about something bold, something audacious enough to elevate their republic in the eyes of the Christian world. They decided Venice needed a new patron saint, not just any saint, but one whose authority could rival the greatest religious centres of the age. Their choice would lead to one of the most famous acts of holy theft in medieval history. By the early 9th century, Venice had already begun to grow into something more than a scattered refuge in the marshes. The lagoon settlements had developed stability, their merchants were travelling further across the Mediterranean, and the political structure of the Republic was slowly taking shape. The Doge and the councils governed the city with cautious balance, while ships carrying salt, timber, and goods from inland Italy began to appear more frequently in distant ports. Yet for all its growing strength, Venice still lacked something that many powerful cities possessed. It lacked a spiritual identity grand enough to match its ambitions. In the medieval world, religion was inseparable from politics. Power was measured not only in soldiers or wealth, but also in sacred authority. Cities competed fiercely for relics, bones of saints, fragments of holy objects, or anything believed to have been touched by divine figures. These relics drew pilgrims, and pilgrims brought money, prestige, and influence. A city that possessed the remains of a great saint was not just a political centre, it became a destination for the faithful across Christendom. Rome had the tombs of the apostles Peter and Paul. Constantinople possessed an enormous treasury of sacred relics gathered from across the Christian world. Other cities proudly displayed fragments of the true cross or the remains of early martyrs. Venice, by comparison, had little to offer. Its patron saint at the time was Saint Theodore, a relatively minor figure in the Christian tradition, and one closely associated with Byzantium. For a city that was gradually moving toward independence from the Byzantine world, this association felt increasingly inadequate. The leaders of Venice understood something important. If the Republic was going to stand among the great powers of the Mediterranean, it needed a patron saint of comparable stature. Not merely a local protector, but someone whose name carried weight across the Christian world. Their choice was astonishingly ambitious. They decided that Venice should claim the body of St. Mark the Evangelist. Mark was not simply a saint. He was one of the 4 authors of the Gospels, a figure whose words formed the foundation of Christian scripture. According to tradition, Mark had travelled widely as a missionary, and eventually died in Alexandria in Egypt, where his remains were preserved in a shrine that attracted pilgrims from across the region. For Venice to possess such a relic would instantly elevate its religious standing. There was, however, a very obvious obstacle. Alexandria was under the rule of a Muslim caliphate. Openly requesting the relic would almost certainly fail. Attempting to seize it by force would be impossible. The only option was stealth. In the year 828, 2 Venetian merchants set out on a mission that combined devotion, politics, and a certain amount of audacity. Their names were Buono de Malamocco and Rustico de Torcello. Both men were experienced traders familiar with the commercial networks of the Mediterranean. Like many Venetians of their time, they sailed frequently between Christian and Muslim ports, carrying cargo, negotiating deals, and gathering information about markets and opportunities. Their profession made them ideal candidates for such an undertaking. Merchants could travel where soldiers could not. When they arrived in Alexandria, they began quietly arranging access to the shrine where St. Mark's remains were kept. The traditional story describes how the Venetians convinced the Christian custodians of the shrine that the relic was in danger. Under Muslim rule, they argued, the saint's body might eventually be destroyed or desecrated. Venice, they claimed, was a devout Christian city capable of honouring and protecting the relic properly. It is difficult to know exactly how persuasive their argument was. Money may have played a role. Bribery was hardly unknown in medieval diplomacy or trade, but whatever combination of persuasion and payment they used, the Venetians eventually succeeded in gaining possession of the saint's remains. Obtaining the relic, however, was only half the challenge. The greater problem was getting it out of Egypt. Ships leaving Alexandria were subject to inspection by Muslim customs officials. Cargo was examined carefully to ensure that prohibited goods or stolen property were not being smuggled out of the port. If the authorities discovered that the merchants were attempting to remove the body of a Christian saint, one revered by the local population, the consequences could have been severe. The Venetians therefore devised a plan that relied on cultural knowledge as much as boldness. They placed the saint's body inside a large basket. Then they covered it with layers of pork and cabbage leaves. To Muslim officials, pork was considered ritually impure. Contact with it was avoided whenever possible. The merchants hoped that the inspectors would recoil from examining the contents too closely. According to the story that later became part of Venetian legend, the plan worked perfectly. When the officials lifted the covering and saw the pork beneath, they immediately pulled back in disgust. Rather than investigate further, they waved the cargo through without a proper inspection. The ship departed Alexandria carrying the body of St. Mark, hidden beneath a layer of meat that no inspector wished to touch. When Buono and Rustico finally arrived back in Venice with their extraordinary cargo, the city exploded in celebration. Church bells rang across the lagoon. Crowds gathered along the canals. The relic was carried through the city in a solemn procession, while priests, nobles, and ordinary citizens watched in awe. For Venice, this moment was transformative. The city now possessed the remains of one of Christianity's most revered evangelists. Pilgrims began travelling to Venice to visit the shrine. The Republic suddenly possessed a spiritual authority that rivaled many older religious centres. To house the relic, the Venetians began constructing a magnificent new church. This would become St. Mark's Basilica. Unlike the austere Roman churches of Western Europe, the basilica was designed in a style heavily influenced by Byzantine architecture. Domes rose above the structure, while its interior walls and ceilings were covered with golden mosaics that shimmered in the candlelight. The church stood beside the Doge's palace in the great open space that would become St. Mark's Square. This arrangement was deliberate. The spiritual heart of the city stood directly beside its political centre. Religion and government were physically and symbolically intertwined. The arrival of St. Mark also gave Venice a powerful new symbol. In Christian iconography, each evangelist was represented by a creature. Mark's symbol was a winged lion holding a book. The Venetians adopted this image immediately. The Lion of St. Mark soon appeared everywhere. It was carved into stone above the gates of the city. It was stamped onto coins. It flew from the masts of Venetian warships and merchant vessels. As Venetian power expanded across the Mediterranean, the lion followed. Wherever Venice established control over a port or island, the symbol was displayed as a declaration of authority. Over time, the winged lion became one of the most recognizable emblems in Europe. For the Republic, it represented both divine protection and political independence. Venice was no longer merely a distant outpost of the Byzantine world. It had claimed its own patron saint, its own sacred symbol, and its own place in the Christian imagination. Yet while the basilica rose and pilgrims arrived, the real engine of Venetian power was being constructed somewhere far less glamorous. Beyond the elegant squares and glittering churches of the city, in the eastern district near the lagoon's edge, a vast complex was beginning to take shape behind high brick walls and guarded gates. Inside those walls, thousands of workers were building something that would astonish visitors from across Europe. It was not a palace. It was not a cathedral. It was a factory for ships. This place would become the arsenal of Venice, the industrial heart of the Republic, and the secret that allowed a small city built on mud to command one of the greatest naval forces in the medieval world. If St. Mark's Basilica became the spiritual heart of Venice, another place served as the beating mechanical heart of the Republic. It stood in the eastern corner of the city, surrounded by high red brick walls and guarded gates. To outsiders it looked like a fortress. To the Venetians it was something even more important. It was the arsenal. In an age long before modern factories, before the Industrial Revolution and the idea of mass production, the arsenal of Venice represented something astonishingly advanced. It was the largest and most efficient shipbuilding complex in Europe, a place where the Republic's naval power was forged plank by plank, rope by rope, cannon by cannon. For Venice, ships were not simply tools of war, they were the lifeblood of the entire state. The city had no farmland worth mentioning. It possessed no great mines of silver or gold. Its survival depended on trade across the sea, and trade depended on ships. Merchant vessels carried spices, silks, and metals across the Mediterranean. War galleys protected those merchant fleets from pirates and rival powers. Without ships, Venice would simply cease to exist as a major power. The arsenal ensured that would never happen. The complex was enormous for its time. Workshops, warehouses, foundries, rope walks, timber yards, and dry docks filled the vast enclosed area. Thousands of workers laboured there, specialists in carpentry, metalworking, sail-making, rope production, and navigation equipment. These men were known as the Arsenalotti, and they formed one of the most respected and privileged groups in Venetian society. Unlike many labourers in medieval Europe, The Arsenalotti were permanent state employees. They were paid regularly by the government. They received benefits unusual for the time, including pensions and sometimes housing for their families. In return, they gave their loyalty to the Republic and guarded its industrial secrets carefully. Knowledge of how the arsenal operated was considered vital to national security. Foreign visitors were rarely allowed inside. The reason was simple. What happened in the arsenal was decades, perhaps centuries ahead of its time. Most shipyards of the medieval world built vessels one at a time. Each ship was essentially a custom project, crafted slowly by skilled artisans working on a single hull. The process could take months or even years. The Venetians approached the problem differently. They developed something remarkably similar to a modern assembly line. Instead of building each ship from start to finish in one place, the arsenal organized production into stages. Different workshops produced standardized parts in large quantities. One building might produce oars. Another would craft rudders. Others manufactured masts, ropes, pulleys, anchors, or sails. Each component was made to standard measurements, so it could fit any ship of a particular type. These parts were then stored in massive warehouses, waiting to be assembled when needed. When the Republic required a new fleet, whether for war or for commercial convoys, the production process could begin immediately. At the centre of the arsenal ran a canal used for assembly. A partially constructed hull would be floated into the canal and slowly moved from one station to another. At each stop, specialised teams of Arsenalotti would climb aboard and install the parts they had mastered. One group fitted the benches for the rowers, another mounted the mast and rigging, another installed weapons and defensive equipment. By the time the ship reached the end of the canal, it was ready for service. The efficiency of this system astonished visitors. One famous story describes a visiting dignitary who was invited to tour the arsenal. During the visit, the Venetians demonstrated their capabilities by constructing and fully equipping a war galley in the time it took the guests to eat a leisurely meal. Whether the story was slightly exaggerated hardly matters. Even if the real process took longer, the arsenal's production speed was extraordinary. Venice could launch ships faster than any rival. In times of crisis, it could expand its navy with breathtaking speed. This ability gave the Republic an enormous strategic advantage. Naval warfare in the Mediterranean depended heavily on galleys, long, narrow ships propelled by rows of oarsmen and supported by sails. These vessels required large crews and constant maintenance, but they were fast and manoeuvrable, ideal for combat in the relatively enclosed waters of the Mediterranean. Because Venice could build and repair them so quickly, it could maintain fleets that rivals struggled to match. The arsenal was therefore not merely a shipyard, it was a military-industrial complex centuries before the concept existed elsewhere. It allowed a relatively small city to project power across thousands of miles of sea. But the arsenal also symbolized something deeper about Venetian society. The Republic valued organization, discipline, and planning. Decisions were rarely left to chance. The same mindset that created the complicated political structure of councils and committees also shaped the industrial structure of the arsenal. Everything had its place. Every worker had a defined task. Efficiency mattered more than spectacle. Yet Venice did not rely solely on industry to express its identity as a maritime power. Once each year, the Republic staged a ceremony that celebrated its relationship with the sea in a far more theatrical way. This was the festival known as the Marriage to the Sea. The ceremony took place on the Feast of the Ascension, one of the most important days in the Venetian calendar. On that morning, the Doge and the highest officials of the Republic gathered along the waterfront in elaborate ceremonial dress. Waiting for them was the most magnificent ship Venice had ever built. It was called the Bucintoro. Unlike the war galleys produced in the arsenal, the Bucintoro was not designed for battle. It was a floating palace, a ceremonial vessel whose purpose was to embody the grandeur of the Republic. The ship was immense, with 2 decks and dozens of skilled rowers who propelled it through the water. Every surface of the vessel was decorated. Golden carvings covered the sides. Sculptures of mythical creatures and allegorical figures rose from its structure. Rich fabrics hung from the railings, and the entire ship glittered in the sunlight with layers of gold leaf. When the Bucintoro emerged from its special shelter and glided onto the lagoon, it looked less like a ship than a moving monument. The Doge boarded the vessel accompanied by senators, ambassadors, and church officials. Around them gathered hundreds of other boats, gondolas, merchant vessels, and decorated barges forming a grand procession that moved slowly through the lagoon. The entire city turned out to watch. Crowds lined the canals and waterfronts. Church bells rang across Venice. Music echoed over the water as the procession moved toward the mouth of the lagoon, where the calm inner waters met the open Adriatic Sea. There the flotilla came to a halt. The Doge stepped forward holding a golden ring. Lifting it high so all could see, he recited the traditional Latin words of the ceremony. "We marry thee, O sea, as a sign of true and everlasting dominion." Then he cast the ring into the water. The gesture symbolized Venice's eternal bond with the sea. It was both a prayer and a declaration. The Republic acknowledged that its survival depended on the waters surrounding it, but it also proclaimed its authority over those waters. For the Venetians, this was not merely poetic symbolism. The sea truly was their lifeline. It provided food, trade routes, protection from invasion, and the wealth that funded the city's palaces and churches. The annual ceremony reminded everyone, citizens and foreign observers alike, that Venice saw itself not as a city beside the sea, but as a city married to it. Together, the arsenal and the marriage to the sea captured the essence of Venice. One represented practical power, the disciplined industry that built fleets capable of dominating the Mediterranean. The other represented civic identity, the belief that the Republic's destiny was inseparable from the waters that surrounded it. This balance of pragmatism and spectacle would define Venice for centuries. But the strength of the arsenal and the unity of the Republic would soon be tested by events far beyond the lagoon. At the dawn of the 13th century, a call echoed across Europe, a call for a new crusade to reclaim the Holy Land. For the Knights of France and the Holy Roman Empire, it promised glory and salvation. At the dawn of the 13th century, Europe was once again stirred by a familiar call. The Pope had declared a new crusade, urging Christian rulers and knights to launch another great expedition to the Holy Land. Jerusalem, the sacred city that had once been taken by crusaders in the previous century, had fallen again under Muslim control. To many in Europe, reclaiming it was not merely a political objective, but a spiritual obligation. In 1198, Pope Innocent III proclaimed what would become known as the Fourth Crusade. Across France and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, nobles and knights answered the call. Lords gathered soldiers, priests preached sermons about salvation through holy war, and banners bearing crosses appeared across castles and towns. Yet organising such a massive expedition required more than enthusiasm. Armies needed ships to cross the Mediterranean, and there was only one place capable of providing them: Venice. By this time, the Republic had already built the most advanced shipbuilding infrastructure in Europe. The arsenal could construct fleets with remarkable speed, and Venetian sailors possessed deep experience navigating the Mediterranean. If the Crusaders wished to transport tens of thousands of soldiers to the eastern Mediterranean, they needed Venetian ships. In 1201, envoys from the crusading leaders arrived in Venice to negotiate. The Doge who greeted them was a remarkable figure. His name was Enrico Dandolo. Dandolo was already an old man, well into his 90s according to most accounts, and he was blind. But his physical limitations concealed a mind of extraordinary sharpness. Those who met him quickly realized that he possessed immense determination and a clear vision of Venice's interests. When the Crusader envoys presented their request, Dandolo understood immediately what they were asking. They wanted Venice to build and supply a fleet capable of transporting a massive army across the Mediterranean. This would require the Republic to suspend nearly all normal commercial shipping for an entire year. The arsenal would have to devote its full capacity to constructing transports and warships. Venetian sailors would need to crew them. The entire city would have to reorganize its economic life around this single project. Dandolo and the Venetian councils agreed, but at a price. The Crusaders would pay 85,000 silver marks. It was an enormous sum, one of the largest financial agreements of the Middle Ages. In return, Venice promised to provide ships capable of transporting approximately 33,000 men and 4,500 horses. The arsenal immediately began its work. Timber was hauled into the shipyards. Workers laboured day and night constructing vessels and assembling equipment. For an entire year, the city prepared for the crusade. Then, in the summer of 1202, the Crusader army began arriving in Venice. But something had gone terribly wrong. The army was far smaller than expected. Thousands of knights who had originally pledged to join the expedition had chosen different routes or abandoned the effort altogether. Some sailed directly from other ports. Others simply failed to appear. As a result, the Crusader forces that actually gathered in Venice were only a fraction of the number that had been promised. The financial consequences were immediate. The Crusaders could not pay the full amount they owed. They had collected money from their followers, but it was nowhere near the agreed 85,000 silver marks. The army found itself trapped in an awkward and dangerous situation. They were guests in Venice, dependent on Venetian ships to continue their journey, yet unable to fulfill the financial contract that had made the expedition possible. For Venice, the situation was equally alarming. The Republic had spent enormous resources building the fleet. Its normal trade had been disrupted for months. If the Crusaders could not pay, the city faced severe financial losses. A tense stalemate developed. The Crusader army camped on the islands of the Lagoon, waiting anxiously while negotiations continued. The Venetians, meanwhile, faced the uncomfortable reality of hosting thousands of armed knights who had no way to leave. It was at this moment that Enrico Dandolo revealed his political brilliance. Rather than abandon the project or attempt to force immediate payment, he proposed an alternative solution. The Crusaders could repay part of their debt through military service. Dandolo suggested that before travelling to the Holy Land, the Crusader army could assist Venice in capturing a rebellious port city along the Dalmatian coast. This city, known as Zara, had once belonged to Venice, but had recently broken away and placed itself under the protection of the King of Hungary. From Venice's perspective, reclaiming Zara was both a matter of pride and a strategic necessity. The port sat along important trade routes in the Adriatic Sea. Losing control of it weakened Venetian influence in the region. For the Crusaders, however, the proposal was deeply troubling. Zara was a Christian city. The crusade had been proclaimed as a war against Muslim powers in the Holy Land. Attacking fellow Christians violated the moral and spiritual purpose of the expedition. Many Crusaders protested strongly against the plan. Even the Pope opposed the idea. Pope Innocent III explicitly forbade the attack and warned that anyone participating in such an action could face excommunication. But the Crusaders faced a harsh reality. They were heavily in debt to Venice, unable to continue their journey without the ships the Republic had built. Many leaders feared that refusing Dandolo's proposal could leave the army stranded indefinitely. After intense debate, the majority reluctantly agreed. To seal the agreement, Dandolo performed a dramatic act that stunned those present. During a great ceremony in St. Mark's Basilica, the elderly Doge appeared before the gathered Crusaders and declared that he himself would take the cross and join the crusade. Despite his age and blindness, he would sail with the army to the Holy Land. The gesture electrified the crowd. Here was the leader of one of Europe's greatest maritime cities personally committing himself to the crusading cause. Many Crusaders interpreted it as proof that the expedition still possessed divine purpose. In reality, Dandolo had achieved something extraordinary. He had redirected the crusade in a way that served Venetian interests. In the autumn of 1202, the massive fleet finally set sail from Venice. Hundreds of ships carried soldiers, horses, and supplies across the Adriatic Sea. Their first destination was not the Holy Land. It was Zara. When the fleet appeared before the city, the inhabitants reacted with shock and disbelief. They raised crosses and Christian banners on their walls, hoping to remind the Crusaders that they were attacking fellow believers. But the assault proceeded. After a short siege, Zara fell. The Crusaders entered the city and looted it, marking one of the most controversial episodes in crusading history. For Venice, however, the objective had been achieved. Zara was back under Venetian control. The army then settled in the captured city for the winter. Snow and cold winds swept across the Dalmatian coast while the Crusaders waited for spring to continue their journey. It was during this uneasy winter that an unexpected visitor arrived, someone whose proposal would change the entire course of the crusade. He was a young Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos, and the offer he brought with him would tempt both the Crusaders and the Venetians in ways they had never anticipated. During the winter of 1202-1203, the Crusader army remained encamped in the captured city of Zara. The campaign had already taken a controversial turn. A Christian army had attacked and looted a Christian city, and the Pope's warnings still hung over the expedition like a shadow. Some Crusaders had already left in protest, refusing to participate further. Those who remained faced an uncertain future. It was in this uneasy atmosphere that a new figure arrived. He was a young man of noble bearing, carrying with him a proposal that seemed almost unbelievable. His name was Alexios Angelos, and he claimed to be the rightful heir to the throne of the Byzantine Empire. To understand why his arrival mattered so much, one must look briefly at the chaotic politics of Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire had once been the most powerful state in the Mediterranean world, but by the end of the 12th century, it was struggling with internal instability and declining authority. Rival factions competed for power within the imperial court. Emperors were overthrown, blinded, imprisoned, or murdered with unsettling frequency. Alexios Angelos was the son of a deposed emperor. His father, Isaac II Angelos, had once ruled Byzantium but had been overthrown and imprisoned by his own brother, who seized the throne as Emperor Alexios III. The younger Alexios had managed to escape from captivity and flee westward, searching desperately for allies who could help him reclaim the throne. When he heard that the Crusader army was wintering at Zara, he recognized an opportunity. Alexios travelled to the Crusaders and presented them with an extraordinary offer. If the Crusader army would sail to Constantinople and restore him and his father to power, he promised to reward them beyond anything they had expected. He would pay their entire debt to Venice. He would provide additional money to fund the Crusade's journey to the Holy Land. He would supply soldiers for the campaign, and he would even promise to bring the Byzantine Church into submission under the authority of the Pope, ending the long religious divide between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic worlds. For the Crusaders, the proposal was tempting. Their army was deeply in debt and lacked the resources needed to reach Egypt, their intended target in the Holy Land. Supporting Alexios offered a way to solve those financial problems while also achieving what many considered a noble objective: restoring a rightful ruler and potentially healing the centuries-old schism between the Eastern and Western churches. For Venice, however, the proposal held an even greater appeal. Constantinople was not just the capital of Byzantium, it was the richest city in the Christian world, a vast centre of trade and wealth, whose markets had attracted Venetian merchants for generations. Yet relations between Venice and the Byzantine Empire had grown increasingly strained over the years. Helping Alexios reclaim the throne could place a friendly ruler in power, one deeply indebted to the Republic. Doge Enrico Dandolo quickly understood the strategic possibilities. The Venetian fleet possessed the power to transport and support the Crusader army in an attack on Constantinople. If successful, Venice could secure enormous commercial advantages and perhaps even territorial concessions within the empire. After weeks of debate, the leaders of the Crusade made their decision. They would sail to Constantinople. Thus, the Fourth Crusade, originally intended to liberate Jerusalem, was redirected toward the capital of the Byzantine Empire. In the summer of 1203, the vast fleet assembled by Venice crossed the Aegean Sea and approached the legendary city. Constantinople was unlike anything the Crusaders had ever seen. Its massive walls stretched for miles, rising high above the land and sea approaches to the city. Towers guarded the fortifications at regular intervals. Within those walls lived hundreds of thousands of people, far more than any Western European city at the time. The skyline glittered with domes, palaces, and churches covered in gold mosaics. To Western knights accustomed to smaller towns and castles, Constantinople appeared almost unreal. The citizens of the city, meanwhile, were stunned to see the Crusader fleet approaching. A Christian army had arrived at their gates. The first assault began quickly. The Venetian fleet played a crucial role in the attack. Using their ships as floating platforms, Venetian soldiers launched assaults against the sea walls that protected the harbour. Meanwhile, Crusader knights attacked the land walls outside the city. The combined pressure proved too much for the defenders. Emperor Alexios III fled the city in panic, abandoning his throne. With the ruler gone, the people of Constantinople had little choice but to accept the restoration of Isaac II Angelos and his son Alexios as co-emperors. For a brief moment it seemed that the Crusaders had achieved their objective. The rightful emperor had been restored. But the triumph quickly began to unravel. Alexios IV, as the young prince now styled himself, soon discovered that fulfilling his promises was nearly impossible. The Byzantine treasury was nearly empty. The empire had suffered years of political chaos, and raising the enormous sums promised to the Crusaders proved far more difficult than expected. To meet his obligations, Alexios resorted to desperate measures. Taxes were increased. Valuable objects from churches were melted down for their gold and silver. These actions outraged the population of Constantinople, many of whom already viewed the Crusaders and Venetians with suspicion and hostility. Tensions escalated rapidly. Riots broke out within the city. Violence erupted between locals and Western soldiers. Fires swept through neighbourhoods as the situation spiralled out of control. Eventually, the anger of the population reached a breaking point. A new leader emerged from among the Byzantine elite, Alexios V Doukas. Backed by popular support, he launched a coup against the young emperor. Alexios IV was arrested and later murdered, while his father Isaac II died shortly afterward. The Crusaders suddenly found themselves in a dangerous position. Their ally was dead, their promised payment had vanished, and a hostile new emperor now ruled Constantinople. Negotiations between the Crusaders and the new regime quickly collapsed. Without payment and facing open hostility from the city, the leaders of the crusade reached a grim conclusion. If the empire would not pay them voluntarily, they would take their payment by force. In April of 1204, the Crusader army launched a full-scale assault on Constantinople. Once again, the Venetian fleet played a decisive role. Their ships approached the sea walls, allowing soldiers to climb ladders and attack the defences directly from the harbour. After fierce fighting, sections of the walls were breached. The Crusaders poured into the city. What followed became one of the most infamous episodes of the Middle Ages. For 3 days, Constantinople was subjected to widespread looting and destruction. Churches, monasteries, and palaces were stripped of their treasures. Priceless relics and works of art accumulated over centuries were stolen or destroyed. Fires raged through districts of the city. Even the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia was not spared. Western soldiers entered the sacred building, carrying away gold, silver, and relics that had once symbolized the glory of Byzantium. Horses were reportedly stabled inside the cathedral during the chaos. For the Byzantine Empire, the sack of Constantinople was catastrophic. The city that had stood for nearly 9 centuries as the centre of Eastern Christianity was devastated by an army that claimed to fight in the name of that same faith. For Venice, however, the outcome was extraordinarily profitable. When the spoils of the city were divided, the Venetians took the prizes that mattered most to a maritime power. They secured control of key ports and islands across the eastern Mediterranean. They acquired valuable trade privileges and territories that would strengthen their commercial networks. Among the treasures brought back to Venice were the famous bronze horses, that would later stand above the entrance of St. Mark's Basilica. Most importantly, Venice gained control over crucial segments of the former Byzantine trade system. The Fourth Crusade had never reached the Holy Land. Instead, it had shattered the Byzantine Empire and reshaped the balance of power across the Mediterranean. Out of the chaos emerged a new reality. Venice, once a small refuge in the Lagoon, now stood as the dominant maritime power of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Republic had transformed itself from a trading city into an empire of the sea. In the chaotic aftermath of the sack of Constantinople, the victors of the Fourth Crusade faced a complicated question. They had destroyed one of the greatest empires of the medieval world. Now they had to decide what to do with its territories. For the French and German Crusader nobles, the answer seemed straightforward. They began carving up the lands of the former Byzantine Empire into feudal kingdoms. Territories were distributed among knights and nobles who established their own domains across Greece and the surrounding regions. Castles were claimed, crowns were offered, and new rulers declared themselves masters of lands they had only just conquered. The Venetians, however, thought very differently. Venice had no interest in becoming a traditional land empire. The leaders of the Republic had little desire to govern large inland populations or administer distant agricultural territories. Their city had been built on trade, ships, and sea routes, not on castles and farmland. Instead, the Venetians created something unique. They constructed what became known as the Stato da Mar, the State of the Sea. Rather than occupying large territories, Venice carefully selected strategic locations, ports, islands, and coastal strongholds that controlled the flow of maritime trade. These places were not chosen for their size or population, but for their position along vital shipping routes. The result was a chain of outposts stretching across the eastern Mediterranean. Each one acted like a link in a vast maritime network connecting Venice to the wealth of the East. This network functioned almost like a series of stepping stones. Venetian ships sailing from the lagoon could travel from one safe harbour to the next, resupplying, repairing, and protecting themselves along the way. These outposts also allowed Venice to monitor shipping lanes and project military power across long distances. Among the territories Venice gained after the Fourth Crusade were several key ports along the coast of Greece and the islands of the Aegean Sea. But the greatest prize was the large and strategically important island of Crete. To the Venetians, Crete became known as the Kingdom of Candia. It was the crown jewel of their overseas empire. Located near the crossroads of eastern Mediterranean trade routes, Crete served as a massive naval base and commercial hub. Venetian ships sailing between the Adriatic, the Levant, and the Black Sea could stop there for supplies, protection, and trade. For centuries, Candia remained one of the most valuable possessions of the Republic. Other islands in the Aegean also came under Venetian control. Though smaller, they were strategically important. Each provided a safe harbour where merchant fleets could shelter from storms or hostile ships. In addition to islands, Venice secured control of numerous coastal ports. These ports functioned as trade centres where goods from the east could be collected and redistributed. Spices, silks, precious stones, metals, and luxury goods flowed through these hubs before continuing toward the markets of Europe. The system worked with remarkable efficiency. Venice had effectively constructed a maritime highway stretching from the Adriatic to the far corners of the eastern Mediterranean. Ships travelling along this route could rely on Venetian protection and infrastructure at every stage of the journey. Governance in these overseas territories was handled carefully. Rather than allowing local rulers to maintain independent authority, Venice typically appointed governors from among its own noble families. These officials were responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and ensuring that trade continued to flow smoothly. Yet Venetian rule was often pragmatic. The Republic rarely attempted to completely transform the cultures of the territories it controlled. Greek populations living on islands such as Crete continued to practice their language, customs, and orthodox religion. Venetian administrators were primarily concerned with maintaining stability and protecting commerce. This practical approach allowed the empire to function with relatively limited resources. Venice did not need enormous armies to control its overseas territories. Its navy and its strategic network of fortified ports were usually enough to maintain order. By the mid-13th century, the Venetian maritime empire had become one of the most sophisticated commercial systems in the world. From the Lagoon city in northern Italy, trade routes extended outward like the spokes of a wheel. Goods from Asia passed through Middle Eastern markets, crossed the Mediterranean to Venetian ports, and eventually reached the markets of Europe. The profits from this trade were immense. But the Venetian spirit of exploration and commerce did not stop at the edges of its maritime empire. Some merchants looked even further east, beyond the familiar routes of the Mediterranean, into lands that most Europeans could scarcely imagine. Among those merchants was a young man whose name would become legendary. His name was Marco Polo. In 1271, Marco Polo was only 17 years old when he set out from Venice on what would become one of the most extraordinary journeys of the Middle Ages. He travelled with his father Niccolo and his uncle Maffeo, both experienced merchants who had already ventured deep into Asia. Unlike most Venetian traders who travelled by ship, the Polo family embarked on a long overland journey. Their route followed the ancient network of trade paths known as the Silk Road. The journey was slow and difficult. For months they travelled across the mountains of Anatolia and the deserts of Persia. They crossed harsh landscapes where water was scarce and bandits were a constant threat. Eventually they climbed into the high mountain ranges of Central Asia, the Pamir Mountains, sometimes called the Roof of the World. After more than 3 years of travel, they finally reached the court of one of the most powerful rulers on earth. His name was Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan was the ruler of the Mongol Empire in China, an empire that stretched across much of Asia. His court was magnificent, filled with diplomats, scholars, and merchants from many different lands. When the Polos arrived, they must have appeared almost exotic foreign traders from a distant city built on water. Yet Kublai Khan was fascinated by them. The emperor was curious about the wider world and eager to learn about Europe. Marco Polo, intelligent and observant, impressed him greatly. Over time, the young Venetian became a trusted servant of the Mongol ruler. For nearly 17 years, Marco Polo travelled throughout the vast territories of the Mongol Empire. He visited cities far larger than any he had seen in Europe. He witnessed the use of paper money, something almost unimaginable in the West at the time. He observed an efficient postal system that allowed messages to travel quickly across enormous distances. To a Venetian merchant, these experiences must have seemed extraordinary. Eventually, after more than 2 decades abroad, the Polo family received permission to return home. Their journey back took them by sea across the Indian Ocean and around the southern coast of Asia. When they finally reached Venice in 1295, 24 years had passed since their departure. Legend tells that the Polos arrived wearing worn Mongol clothing and appeared so different that even relatives struggled to recognize them. During a feast celebrating their return, they reportedly cut open the seams of their garments, revealing precious jewels hidden inside rubies, sapphires, and diamonds that poured onto the table. The story of Marco Polo's travels might have remained little more than a family legend. But fate intervened. A few years later, Venice went to war with its great rival Genoa. During a naval battle in 1298, Marco Polo was captured and imprisoned by the Genoese. While in prison, he met a writer named Rustichello da Pisa. To pass the time, Marco Polo dictated the story of his travels. Rustichello wrote them down, creating the book that became known as The Travels of Marco Polo. When the book spread across Europe, readers were astonished. Many dismissed it as fantasy, calling it Il Milione, the Million Lies. Yet others recognized that Marco Polo had opened a window onto lands and cultures that Europeans had barely imagined. His stories of wealth, cities, and distant kingdoms inspired generations of explorers. Among those who later studied his writings was a navigator named Christopher Columbus. But while Venetian merchants were exploring the far reaches of Asia, the Republic's power closer to home faced a growing challenge. Across the Ligurian Sea, another great maritime city was rising. Its name was Genoa. and the rivalry between these two republics would soon erupt into one of the most dangerous wars Venice had ever faced. By the late 14th century, two great maritime republics dominated the commercial life of the Mediterranean. One was Venice, rising from the shallow lagoon at the northern end of the Adriatic Sea. The other was Genoa, built along the steep rocky coast of Liguria in northwestern Italy. Both cities were merchant republics. Both were governed by powerful trading families whose fortunes were tied to shipping, finance, and long-distance commerce. And both had grown wealthy by inserting themselves into the vast network of trade routes connecting Europe with the markets of the East. For generations, the two cities had been locked in a slow, bitter rivalry. The Mediterranean was not an open ocean like the Atlantic. It was a crowded commercial highway. Merchant ships sailed constantly between ports, carrying goods that were incredibly valuable for their time. Silks from Asia, spices from India, grain from the Black Sea, metals from Europe, sugar from the Eastern Mediterranean, and countless other commodities. Whoever controlled these routes could grow immensely rich. Venice and Genoa both wanted that control. Throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, the two republics clashed repeatedly. Sometimes the conflict took the form of naval battles. At other times it appeared as trade wars, diplomatic manoeuvring, or small-scale conflicts in distant ports. Venetian and Genoese merchants competed fiercely in the markets of Constantinople, Alexandria, and the Black Sea. Their fleets escorted merchant convoys across dangerous waters where pirates and rival powers waited for opportunities to strike. Occasionally the rivalry exploded into open war. Naval engagements between the two republics could be brutal. Mediterranean galleys were fast and maneuverable ships powered primarily by long rows of oarsmen. When fleets met in battle, they rammed, grappled, and boarded one another in violent close combat. Crossbows, swords, axes, and eventually small cannons were used as crews fought hand-to-hand across the decks. These battles were chaotic and dangerous, but neither side managed to achieve a decisive victory for many years. Then, in 1378, the long rivalry escalated into what would become the most dangerous war Venice had ever faced. Historians call it the War of Chioggia. At the beginning of the conflict, the situation seemed balanced. Both republics possessed strong fleets, and both had allies across Europe willing to support them. The war initially followed familiar patterns. Naval battles occurred across the Mediterranean while merchants tried to protect their trade routes from disruption. But the Genoese leadership soon realized something important. As long as Venice remained safe inside its lagoon, the Republic could always rebuild its fleet and continue fighting. The lagoon had protected Venice for centuries. Its shallow waters and confusing channels made invasion extremely difficult. If Genoa wanted to win the war, it had to do something no enemy had ever truly accomplished before. It had to attack Venice itself. In 1379, the Genoese fleet sailed boldly into the Adriatic. Commanded by experienced admirals, the ships pushed northward toward the Venetian lagoon. The move shocked the Republic. Few enemies had ever attempted such an aggressive maneuver. The lagoon was supposed to be Venice's greatest defence, yet the Genoese pressed forward. Navigating carefully through the waters at the southern entrance to the lagoon, they captured the port of Chioggia. This small fishing town controlled an important channel leading toward Venice itself. Once the Genoese fleet occupied the harbour, they effectively established a base only a short distance from the city. For the first time in its history, Venice faced the possibility of direct conquest. Panic spread through the Republic. The Genoese fleet had cut off major access routes to the sea. Merchant convoys could no longer arrive safely. Food supplies from surrounding regions were threatened. If the blockade continued, Venice could slowly starve. The psychological impact was enormous. For centuries, the lagoon had protected the city from invasion. Now, enemy ships sat within it. Genoese sailors could look north and imagine the towers and domes of Venice rising above the water in the distance. The Genoese commanders believed victory was close. Their admiral reportedly sent a mocking message to the Venetian government, declaring that he would soon bridle the horses of Saint Mark. The phrase referred to the 4 bronze horses displayed above the entrance of St. Mark's Basilica, symbols of Venetian pride and imperial power. If Genoa captured Venice, those horses would be taken as trophies. Inside the city, the situation was desperate. The Venetian government called emergency meetings. Merchants, nobles, and officials gathered in the chambers of the Great Council to debate how the Republic could survive. Some feared that defeat was inevitable. Others insisted that Venice must fight to the end. The Republic mobilized everything it had. Merchant ships were converted into war vessels. Wealthy families contributed money to fund new ships and weapons. Citizens volunteered to serve as sailors or soldiers. Even prisoners were released from jails and offered freedom if they joined the defense of the city. But Venice also needed experienced leadership. The man chosen to command the defense was Vettor Pisani. Pisani had previously served as a naval commander during the war, but after suffering a defeat earlier in the conflict, he had been imprisoned by the Venetian government. Such harsh treatment of commanders was not unusual in Venice, where failure was often punished severely. Now, with the city facing disaster, the government freed him and restored his command. Pisani understood that a direct attack against the Genoese fleet would likely fail. Their ships were strongly positioned inside Chioggia's harbour, protected by narrow channels and fortified defences. Instead, he devised an audacious plan. If Venice could not break the blockade, it would trap the blockaders. Under Pisani's orders, Venetian crews began moving through the lagoon at night. They loaded old ships with heavy stones and deliberately sank them in the narrow channels leading out of Chioggia. One by one, these scuttled vessels blocked the waterways. The entrances to the harbour gradually closed. The Genoese fleet, which had sailed into the lagoon expecting to conquer Venice, suddenly found itself trapped. The narrow channels that had allowed them to enter were now sealed with sunken ships. The situation had been completely reversed. Now the Genoese were the ones blockaded. For months, the two fleets faced each other in tense stalemate. The Venetians controlled the entrances to the harbour, preventing supplies from reaching the trapped Genoese ships. Food began to run out. Conditions aboard the Genoese vessels deteriorated. Crews suffered from hunger, disease, and exhaustion. Attempts to break through the blockade failed. Meanwhile, inside Venice, the population watched the slow siege with anxious determination. Every day brought rumours about the progress of the conflict. Some feared the Genoese might somehow escape and renew their assault. But as the months passed, it became clear that Pisani's strategy was working. The Genoese fleet was weakening. By the summer of 1380, the trapped sailors were close to starvation. Their ships were damaged, their crews exhausted, and their supplies nearly gone. Finally, the Genoese commanders had no choice. They surrendered. The victory was total. The Genoese fleet that had threatened Venice's existence was captured or destroyed. Thousands of enemy sailors became prisoners. The war effectively ended with Venice still standing as the dominant naval power of the Mediterranean. The triumph at Chioggia became one of the greatest moments in Venetian history. It proved the resilience of the Republic. Even when faced with near destruction, Venice had used ingenuity, determination, and strategic thinking to reverse the situation. Genoa would remain an important financial centre, but its ability to challenge Venice at sea had been broken. With its greatest rival weakened, Venice entered the height of its golden age. Merchant ships sailed regularly between the Adriatic and the eastern Mediterranean. Trade routes stretched toward Constantinople, Alexandria, and beyond. The wealth flowing into the city transformed its skyline. Palaces rose along the Grand Canal. Churches were decorated with magnificent artworks. Markets filled with goods from distant lands. At the centre of this prosperity was a single group of commodities that Europeans valued more than almost anything else. Spices. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were worth extraordinary sums in medieval Europe. They preserved meat, flavoured food, and served as medicines and luxury goods. A small sack of peppercorns could be worth a fortune. And for centuries, Venice had positioned itself as the gatekeeper of the spice trade. Ships from the eastern Mediterranean brought spices to Venetian warehouses. From there, the goods were distributed across Europe, sold at prices that generated enormous profits for the Republic. The victory over Genoa meant that Venice now stood almost alone at the centre of this system. Its merchants controlled the most valuable trade routes in the Mediterranean. Its fleets protected the flow of wealth across the sea. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, Venice stood at the height of its prosperity. The Republic that had once been a cluster of fragile settlements in a muddy lagoon had grown into one of the richest and most influential cities in the world. Its fleet sailed across the Mediterranean in organised convoys. Its merchants negotiated in the markets of Alexandria, Constantinople, and the Levant. Wealth flowed steadily back into the lagoon, filling the coffers of the Republic and transforming the appearance of the city itself. At the centre of this prosperity was a trade that shaped the economy of all Europe. It was the spice trade. To modern readers, spices may seem like small luxuries ingredients that add flavour to food. In medieval Europe, however, they were vastly more important. Pepper, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, and other spices were among the most valuable commodities in the world. They preserved meat before the age of refrigeration, masked unpleasant flavours in stored food, and served as key ingredients in medicines. Spices also functioned as symbols of wealth. To serve heavily spiced dishes at a banquet was a way of displaying status and prosperity. Because spices came from distant lands, they were rare in Europe. Most originated in Southeast Asia and the islands of the Indian Ocean. From there they travelled along long, complicated routes through the markets of India and the Middle East before finally reaching the Mediterranean. By the time they arrived in European markets, their value had multiplied many times over. Venice had positioned itself perfectly to control this trade. The journey of spices toward Europe typically followed a predictable pattern. Arab and Indian merchants transported them across the Indian Ocean to ports in the Middle East. From there, the goods were carried by caravans across desert routes to major Mediterranean cities such as Alexandria in Egypt or Aleppo in Syria. It was at these ports that Venetian merchants were waiting. The Republic maintained strong diplomatic relationships with the Muslim rulers of these regions. Despite the religious divisions between Christian Europe and the Islamic world, trade remained remarkably active. Venetian merchants negotiated agreements that allowed them to purchase spices and other Eastern goods directly from Middle Eastern traders. Once the spices reached Venetian ships, the next stage of the journey began. Merchant galleys, large ships capable of carrying both cargo and armed crews, sailed from Alexandria or other eastern ports back toward the Adriatic. These voyages were often organised into convoys to protect against pirates and rival fleets. When the ships finally reached Venice, the entire city felt the impact. The arrival of a spice convoy was a major event. Merchants, dock workers, officials and buyers gathered along the waterfront as cargo was unloaded. The air filled with unfamiliar scents, pepper, cinnamon, cloves aromas that hinted at the distant lands from which the goods had travelled. From the docks, the cargo moved toward the markets of the Rialto. The Rialto district was the commercial centre of Venice. Warehouses, counting houses and marketplaces filled the area. Here the spices were carefully weighed, inspected, and taxed by officials of the Republic. Every sack of pepper or bundle of cinnamon generated revenue for the Venetian government. Once the goods were sold, they continued their journey across Europe. Merchants from Germany, France, and the Italian mainland purchased spices in Venice and transported them to markets far inland. By the time the goods reached northern Europe, their price had increased even further. This system created extraordinary wealth. The profits from the spice trade funded nearly every aspect of Venetian society. They paid for the construction of grand palaces along the Grand Canal. They supported artists, architects, and craftsmen who transformed the city into a masterpiece of Renaissance beauty. They financed the powerful fleets that protected Venetian shipping routes. In a very real sense, Venice was built on spice. The glittering city that travellers admired, the marble facades, the elegant bridges, the churches filled with golden mosaics was the physical result of centuries of successful trade. But the prosperity of Venice depended on more than commerce alone. It also relied on the city's ability to defend its position against rivals. Although Genoa had been weakened after the War of Chioggia, other threats were beginning to appear. Powerful states were rising across Europe and the Mediterranean. Some sought to compete with Venice commercially. Others viewed the Republic's wealth as an opportunity to be seized. One of the most significant dangers came not from the sea, but from the land. For centuries, Venice had focused almost entirely on maritime power. Its strength lay in its navy and its overseas trade network. The mainland territories of northern Italy had played only a minor role in Venetian politics. But during the 15th century, the political landscape of Italy began to change. Powerful regional states were emerging. The Duchy of Milan, ruled by ambitious dynasties such as the Visconti and later the Sforza family, was expanding its influence across northern Italy. Other states, including Florence and the Papal States, were also competing for territory and influence. For the leaders of Venice, this new reality raised serious concerns. The Republic's Lagoon defences protected the city from naval invasion, but they did little to prevent hostile armies from controlling the surrounding mainland. If an enemy captured the territories just beyond the Lagoon, Venice could be cut off from essential supplies. The city depended heavily on imported food. Grain, livestock, and other agricultural products came from mainland regions. If those regions fell into hostile hands, Venice might face shortages or even famine. This possibility sparked a heated debate within the Venetian government. One group of leaders argued that Venice should remain focused on the sea. They believed that the Republic's identity and strength came from its maritime empire. Becoming involved in the complicated wars of mainland Italy, they warned, could drain resources and weaken the city's traditional advantages. Another faction believed the Republic had no choice. To ensure its survival, Venice needed to control the lands surrounding the lagoon. By establishing a buffer zone of mainland territories, the city could secure its food supply and prevent rival powers from threatening its borders. Eventually, the expansionist view prevailed. During the early 15th century, Venice began a campaign to acquire territory on the Italian mainland. This new domain became known as the Stato di Terra, the state of the land. Venetian armies moved inland, capturing cities such as Padua, Vicenza, and Verona. Through a combination of diplomacy, alliances, and military force, the Republic gradually extended its influence across the fertile plains of the Veneto region. This expansion transformed Venice. For the first time in its history, the Republic was not only a maritime power, but also a significant land-based state. The territories of the Stato di Terra provided grain, livestock, and agricultural resources that helped sustain the city's population. But controlling mainland territory introduced new challenges. Venice had long relied on sailors and merchants rather than large land armies. Its citizens were experts in navigation and trade, not in fighting battles on horseback across Italian fields. To solve this problem, the Republic turned to a distinctive feature of Renaissance warfare. It hired mercenaries. These professional soldiers, known as condottieri, fought for payment rather than loyalty to a particular state. They commanded private armies of cavalry and infantry that could be hired by governments willing to pay their fees. For Venice, the condottieri provided a convenient solution. The Republic could wage wars on land without transforming its own citizens into full-time soldiers. Contracts specified the number of troops, the duration of service, and the payment the mercenary commanders would receive. But the system carried risks. Mercenary leaders were ambitious men, and their loyalty depended on money. Some switched sides during conflicts if offered better contracts by rival states. Others pursued personal ambitions that conflicted with the interests of their employers. The Venetian government remained deeply suspicious of them. One famous example illustrates this distrust. A mercenary commander named Francesco Busone, known as Carmagnola, had achieved significant victories for Venice during its wars against Milan. He became a celebrated military leader and gained considerable popularity. But success could be dangerous in Venice. The government began to suspect that Carmagnola might have divided loyalties or secret ambitions. They worried that a powerful general commanding a large army could one day threaten the Republic itself. In 1432, the Venetian authorities summoned Carmagnola back to Venice, under the pretense of discussing military strategy. When he entered the Doge's palace, he was arrested. After a secret trial conducted by the Council of Ten, he was convicted of treason and executed in St. Mark's Square. The message was unmistakable. No matter how successful a general might be, the Republic would never allow military power to challenge its authority. Venice had built its strength on careful balance between wealth and discipline, between commerce and security. Even at the height of its prosperity, the Republic remained cautious, always watching for threats that could disturb its delicate system. For centuries, the wealth of Venice had depended on a carefully balanced system of trade that stretched across the known world. Spices grown in distant tropical islands travelled through India and the Middle East, before reaching Mediterranean ports such as Alexandria and Beirut. From there, Venetian merchants purchased them and carried them back across the sea to Europe. It was a system built on geography. Venice sat at the perfect crossroads between East and West. Goods arriving from Asia flowed through the eastern Mediterranean. European merchants then travelled to Venice to buy them. The Republic acted as the middleman in one of the most profitable commercial systems in history. For generations, this arrangement made Venice unimaginably rich. But in the late 15th century, something began to change. Far from the Mediterranean world, on the Atlantic coast of Europe, a small kingdom had begun to pursue a very different vision of global trade. That kingdom was Portugal. Portuguese rulers had become fascinated by the idea of reaching Asia by sailing around Africa. If they could reach the markets of India directly, they would no longer need to rely on the long caravan routes controlled by Middle Eastern traders or the maritime network dominated by Venice. At first, this idea seemed almost impossible. European sailors knew very little about the Atlantic Ocean south of Morocco. The waters were believed to be dangerous and mysterious. Maps were incomplete, and many believed that ships sailing too far south might encounter boiling seas or monstrous creatures. Yet Portuguese explorers continued pushing further. The effort was supported by Prince Henry of Portugal, a royal patron who encouraged exploration and funded voyages along the African coast. Henry himself rarely sailed, but his support helped build the foundations of Portuguese navigation. Portuguese shipbuilders developed new types of vessels capable of handling the rough waters of the Atlantic. One of these ships was the caravel, a small but highly manoeuvrable vessel equipped with triangular lateen sails that allowed sailors to tack against the wind. Unlike the Mediterranean galleys used by Venice, which relied heavily on oars, caravels were designed for long ocean voyages. Gradually, year after year, Portuguese sailors moved further down the African coast. They mapped rivers, coastlines, and islands previously unknown to Europeans. Each voyage added new knowledge, bringing them closer to their ultimate goal. Then, in 1488, the breakthrough finally came. An explorer named Bartolomeu Dias sailed further south than any European before him. During a violent storm, his fleet was blown around the southern tip of Africa. When the weather cleared, Dias realized he had passed the edge of the continent. He had discovered the route from the Atlantic Ocean into the Indian Ocean. The sailors named the place the Cape of Good Hope. The discovery electrified Portugal. For the first time, a direct sea route to Asia seemed within reach. The final step was to complete the journey to India itself. That mission fell to a determined captain named Vasco da Gama. In 1497, da Gama set sail from Lisbon with 4 ships and a crew willing to risk everything for the promise of discovery and wealth. His fleet followed the now familiar route down the west coast of Africa before rounding the Cape of Good Hope. But the hardest part of the journey was still ahead. The Indian Ocean was vast and unfamiliar to European sailors. Navigation depended heavily on local knowledge and favourable winds. Da Gama's fleet struggled with disease, shortages of food, and exhaustion among the crew. Scurvy, caused by a lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, killed many sailors during the voyage. Despite these challenges, da Gama continued eastward. Finally, in May 1498, his fleet reached the port city of Calicut on the southwestern coast of India. The moment was historic. For the first time, European ships had sailed directly from Europe to India without passing through the traditional trade networks of the Middle East and Mediterranean. The implications were enormous. Portuguese merchants could now buy spices directly from Asian markets and ship them back to Europe without relying on Venetian traders. The long chain of middlemen that had once carried spices across deserts and seas could now be bypassed. When news of this discovery reached Venice, the reaction was immediate and fearful. Merchants gathered in counting houses and marketplaces to discuss the reports arriving from Portugal. At first, some dismissed the stories as exaggerations, but as more voyages confirmed the success of the route, the truth became impossible to ignore. The Venetian diarist, Girolamo Priuli, recorded the mood in the city. He wrote that the discovery of the sea route to India was the worst news that could ever reach Venice. He understood exactly what it meant. For centuries, Venice had controlled the gateway through which Eastern goods entered Europe. Now that gateway was being bypassed entirely. Portuguese fleets began returning to Lisbon carrying cargoes of pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and other spices purchased directly from Asian markets. These goods could be sold in Europe at lower prices than those transported through the Mediterranean system. Gradually, merchants across Europe began turning toward Portuguese suppliers. Venice tried to resist the change. The Republic sought alliances with the rulers of Egypt and the Ottoman Empire in hopes of challenging Portuguese fleets in the Indian Ocean. Venetian diplomats argued that Portuguese expansion threatened not only Venice, but also the traditional Muslim trading networks that connected Asia and the Middle East. There were even discussions about digging a canal across the Isthmus of Suez. If the Mediterranean could be connected to the Red Sea, Venetian ships might be able to sail directly into the Indian Ocean themselves. The idea was bold and visionary, but the engineering technology of the 15th century simply could not make it happen. Meanwhile, Portuguese power continued to grow. They established fortified trading posts along the coasts of Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. Armed fleets protected their merchant ships, and new expeditions continued expanding their reach across the oceans. The centre of world trade was slowly shifting. For centuries, the Mediterranean had been the beating heart of global commerce. Now the focus was moving westward toward the Atlantic Ocean. Cities like Lisbon and later Amsterdam and London would eventually benefit from this shift. For Venice, however, the consequences were profound. The spice trade did not disappear completely, but the Republic's monopoly over it was broken. Venetian merchants still traded with the East, but the profits were smaller and competition was increasing. Yet the city did not collapse. Venice still possessed enormous wealth accumulated over centuries. Its architecture, art, and cultural institutions flourished. The city continued attracting visitors, artists, and musicians from across Europe. Gradually, Venice began transforming itself. If it could no longer dominate global trade as it once had, it would become something else entirely. It would become the most beautiful and fascinating city in Europe. But even as Venice adapted to these changes, another powerful force was rising in the Eastern Mediterranean. A new empire, young, ambitious, and aggressive, was expanding across the lands that Venice had long considered its commercial sphere. It was the Ottoman Empire, and its rise would bring Venice into a series of brutal conflicts that would shape the final centuries of the Republic's history. While the great trade routes of the world were beginning to shift away from the Mediterranean, Venice still remained one of the most remarkable cities in Europe. Its political power might have been slowly weakening, but the Republic continued to thrive as a cultural and social centre. Visitors arriving by sea were greeted by a skyline unlike any other domes rising above the water, palaces of pale marble lining the canals, and towers that reflected in the shifting light of the lagoon. Life in Venice had always been different from life in other European cities. There were no horses pulling carts through the streets. There were no wide roads filled with wagons. The city existed on water, and the canals served as its streets. Boats carried everything: people, food, furniture, construction materials, even the coffins of the dead. Among all these vessels, one boat eventually became the most famous symbol of Venetian life. It was the gondola. The gondola was not merely a romantic tourist vessel as it is often imagined today. For centuries it served as the primary means of transportation within the city. Its design evolved carefully over generations to suit the unique environment of the Venetian canals. The boat was long and narrow so it could glide through tight waterways. Its bottom was flat, allowing it to move easily through the shallow waters of the lagoon. Most interesting of all, the hull was slightly asymmetrical. This unusual shape allowed a single gondolier standing at the back of the boat to propel it forward using only one oar. By adjusting the angle and pressure of each stroke, the gondolier could steer the vessel in a straight line despite rowing from one side. It was a simple but brilliant design. The gondoliers themselves became a distinctive part of Venetian society. They belonged to a powerful guild, and their profession required skill and experience. Navigating the canals of Venice was not as easy as it appeared. The waterways formed a complex labyrinth of narrow passages, hidden corners, and busy intersections where boats constantly crossed paths. A skilled gondolier needed to understand the rhythm of the city. He needed to know when certain canals became crowded, how tides affected water levels, and how to maneuver quickly around other vessels. Gondoliers often served as guides, messengers, and sometimes confidants for the passengers they carried. They knew the city better than almost anyone else. During the height of Venice's prosperity, gondolas also became symbols of wealth and status. Noble families competed with one another to own the most lavishly decorated boats. Gondolas were covered with colourful fabrics, gilded carvings, and elaborate ornaments. Some displayed family crests or expensive decorations that announced the importance of their owners. The canals of Venice gradually became floating exhibitions of aristocratic wealth. For a republic that prided itself on political stability and balance, this growing display of luxury created an uncomfortable situation. Venetian leaders feared that such extravagant competition could disturb the delicate social order of the city. If noble families constantly attempted to outshine one another in public displays of wealth, it might encourage rivalries or political tensions, so the government intervened. In 1562, the Venetian authorities passed a sumptuary law that regulated the appearance of gondolas. According to this law, almost all gondolas had to be painted a simple, uniform black. Decorations were restricted. The result was one of the most recognizable visual traditions in the world. The elegant black gondola gliding through Venetian canals became a symbol of the city itself. The law revealed something important about the Venetian mindset. The Republic believed in controlling public appearances while allowing private wealth to flourish behind closed doors. Noble families could enjoy luxury inside their palaces, but public displays were carefully regulated to preserve the image of equality among the ruling elite. This careful balance between freedom and control extended into many areas of Venetian life, including religion. Across much of Europe during the Renaissance, the Catholic Church maintained powerful institutions dedicated to enforcing religious orthodoxy. The most famous of these institutions was the Inquisition, a system of tribunals designed to identify and punish heresy. In places like Spain, the Inquisition became notorious for its harsh methods and severe punishments. Venice, however, handled the situation differently. The Republic was a devout Catholic state, but it fiercely guarded its independence from outside authority, even from the Pope. Venetian leaders believed that allowing Rome to control religious courts within the city might threaten the stability of their commercial relationships. After all, Venice was a trading hub filled with foreigners. German merchants who lived in the city often followed the Protestant faith that had spread across northern Europe. Greek traders practiced Orthodox Christianity. Jewish communities played an important role in finance and commerce. If a strict Roman Inquisition aggressively prosecuted these groups, it could damage Venice's economy. So the Republic created its own version of the system. The Venetian Inquisition operated with a unique structure. Religious officials participated in the tribunal, including representatives of the papacy, but alongside them sat 3 lay observers appointed by the Venetian government. These observers were members of the Venetian nobility. They did not vote directly in the tribunal's decisions, but their presence ensured that the state remained aware of every investigation. If a trial threatened political stability or commercial interests, the government could intervene. As a result, the Venetian Inquisition tended to be less brutal than its counterparts in other regions. While it still punished heresy and enforced religious conformity, it rarely engaged in the large-scale persecutions seen elsewhere. Venetian leaders valued order and economic stability above ideological extremism. This pragmatic approach was typical of the Republic. For centuries, Venice had balanced faith with commerce, tradition with practicality. The government's primary goal was always the same: protect the stability of the state. Yet stability would soon face its greatest test. While Venice managed its internal affairs carefully, powerful forces were rising beyond its borders. One of those forces was expanding rapidly across the eastern Mediterranean, the Ottoman Empire. In 1453, the Ottomans captured Constantinople, bringing an end to the Byzantine Empire that had once dominated the region. For Venice, this event was both shocking and dangerous. The Ottomans now controlled the gateway between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. This placed them directly in the path of Venetian trade routes. For the next century, Venice and the Ottoman Empire would struggle repeatedly for control of islands, ports, and sea lanes across the eastern Mediterranean. The conflicts would be long, expensive, and often brutal, and eventually, the struggle would culminate in one of the greatest naval battles of the age, the Battle of Lepanto. The rise of the Ottoman Empire changed the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean more dramatically than any event in centuries. For Venice, whose wealth depended on trade routes that crossed those waters, the expansion of this new empire was both a commercial threat and a military danger. The Ottoman state had begun as a small frontier principality in Anatolia during the late 13th century. Over the following 200 years it expanded relentlessly. Ottoman armies pushed westward into the Balkans, absorbing territories that had once belonged to Byzantium and other Christian kingdoms. Their soldiers were disciplined and experienced, their leaders ambitious, and their empire increasingly organized around a powerful central authority. In 1453, the Ottomans achieved their greatest early victory. Under Sultan Mehmed II, their armies captured Constantinople, the ancient capital of the Byzantine Empire. After a long siege, the massive walls that had protected the city for nearly 1,000 years finally fell. The conquest shocked the Christian world. Constantinople had been one of the greatest cities on earth, a centre of culture, wealth, and religious significance. For Venice, the consequences were immediate. The Republic had maintained strong commercial connections with Constantinople for centuries. Venetian merchants had lived in the city, traded in its markets, and depended on its position as a gateway to the Black Sea. Now that gateway was controlled by a powerful new empire. The Ottomans did not immediately destroy Venetian trade. In fact, commerce continued between the two powers for many years. The Ottomans valued trade just as much as the Venetians did. Venetian merchants still sailed to eastern ports and negotiated agreements with Ottoman officials, but the relationship was fragile. As Ottoman expansion continued, Venice began losing territories that had once formed part of its maritime empire. Islands in the Aegean Sea came under pressure. Fortified ports that had once served as Venetian outposts faced attack. War between the two powers became almost inevitable. Throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, Venice fought several conflicts against the Ottoman Empire. These wars were expensive and exhausting. Each side sought to control key islands and coastal territories that dominated Mediterranean trade routes. The struggle reached one of its most dramatic moments in 1570. That year, the Ottomans launched a massive invasion of the island of Cyprus, one of Venice's most valuable overseas possessions. Cyprus had been under Venetian control for decades and served as a major commercial and strategic centre in the eastern Mediterranean. The Ottoman army landed in overwhelming numbers. Venetian defenders fought fiercely, but the island cities gradually fell. The long siege of Famagusta, the last Venetian stronghold on Cyprus, became legendary for its courage and brutality. When the city finally surrendered in 1571, the Ottoman commander executed the Venetian governor in a particularly gruesome manner. The fall of Cyprus sent shock waves through Europe. The Ottoman Empire now appeared unstoppable. Christian leaders feared that the Ottomans might eventually dominate the entire Mediterranean. In response, Pope Pius V organised a coalition of Christian powers known as the Holy League. This alliance brought together several states that had previously been rivals. Spain, the Papal States, Venice and other Italian powers agreed to combine their naval forces in order to confront the Ottoman fleet. The resulting armada was enormous. More than 200 ships gathered under the command of Don John of Austria, the half-brother of the Spanish king. Venetian galleys formed a large portion of the fleet. Many of the most experienced sailors in the Mediterranean served aboard these ships. Among the Venetian contributions were a new type of warship known as the galleass. The galleass was larger and heavier than a traditional galley. It combined sails and oars for propulsion, but also carried a powerful array of cannons along its sides. These ships functioned almost like floating fortresses, capable of delivering devastating artillery fire. In October 1571, the two great fleets finally met in the Gulf of Patras near the Greek coast. The scale of the battle was immense. More than 400 ships and tens of thousands of sailors and soldiers participated. It was one of the largest naval engagements since the battles of ancient Rome and Carthage. As the fleets approached each other, the Venetian galleasses moved forward into position. When the Ottoman fleet came within range, the galleasses unleashed their cannons. The effect was devastating. The heavy artillery shattered the Ottoman formation before the main fleets even collided. Ships were damaged or sunk, and confusion spread through the Ottoman ranks. Then the two armadas clashed. Galleys rammed each other. Grappling hooks locked ships together. Soldiers leapt across decks, fighting with swords, axes and firearms. The sea filled with smoke from cannon fire, and the cries of thousands of men locked in brutal combat. The battle raged for hours. Gradually, the Holy League gained the advantage. The death of the Ottoman admiral during the fighting caused confusion among the Ottoman crews. One by one, their ships began to retreat or surrender. By the end of the day, the Ottoman fleet had been largely destroyed. The Battle of Lepanto became one of the most celebrated victories in European history. Thousands of Christian galley slaves who had been forced to row Ottoman ships were freed during the battle. Across Europe, news of the victory was greeted with jubilation. For Venice, the triumph was a moment of enormous pride. Yet the victory did not solve the Republic's deeper problems. The alliance of the Holy League soon collapsed due to political disagreements among its members. Without continued support from Spain and other allies, Venice could not sustain the war alone. Eventually, the Republic was forced to sign a peace treaty with the Ottoman Empire. The treaty required Venice to surrender Cyprus permanently. Despite the heroic victory at Lepanto, the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean had already begun shifting. The Ottoman Empire remained strong, and Venice's ability to defend its maritime empire was weakening. But an even greater challenge to Venice's dominance was already underway. While Venice and the Ottomans fought for control of Mediterranean waters, explorers from Western Europe were opening entirely new routes across the oceans, and those new routes would soon change the world. While Venice struggled against the growing power of the Ottoman Empire in the eastern Mediterranean, a quieter but far more transformative change was unfolding elsewhere in the world. It did not involve armies or sieges. It did not involve captured islands or naval battles. Instead, it involved maps, ships, and a new understanding of the oceans. For centuries, the Mediterranean Sea had been the centre of global commerce. It was the meeting place of civilizations, Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, all connected through its waters. Venice had thrived in this environment. Its fleets moved easily between ports, and its merchants controlled the distribution of valuable goods flowing from Asia into Europe. But the age of exploration was shifting that centre of gravity. The Portuguese voyages around Africa had opened a direct sea route to India and the spice markets of Asia. Spanish expeditions, including Christopher Columbus's journey in 1492, had revealed the existence of entirely new continents across the Atlantic. Soon after, explorers such as Ferdinand Magellan would demonstrate that the oceans of the world were connected in ways Europeans had never imagined. Trade was no longer limited to the Mediterranean. The Atlantic Ocean was becoming the new highway of global commerce. This change had enormous consequences for Venice. For centuries, Venetian merchants had acted as the middlemen between Eastern goods and European markets. Spices from India and Southeast Asia passed through the Middle East before reaching the Mediterranean, where Venice purchased them and distributed them across Europe. Now Portuguese ships could bypass that system entirely. They sailed directly to India, loaded their ships with spices, and returned to Lisbon. From there the goods spread throughout Europe at prices Venetian merchants could not easily match. The Republic's economic dominance began to erode. Venice remained wealthy, but the incredible profits of the spice trade slowly declined. Other European powers, Spain, Portugal, and eventually the Dutch and English, were building global empires that stretched across oceans far beyond the reach of Venetian fleets. Yet Venice did not collapse into ruin. Instead, the city gradually transformed itself. If it could no longer dominate the world through trade and naval power, it would dominate through culture, beauty, and spectacle. During the 17th and 18th centuries, Venice became one of the most celebrated cities in Europe. Travellers from across the continent arrived to experience its art, architecture, and unique atmosphere. The city's reputation for elegance and intrigue made it a central destination for wealthy visitors. One of the most famous traditions that flourished during this time was the Carnival of Venice. Carnival was not simply a short festival. It lasted for weeks and sometimes months. During this time, the entire city became a stage for celebration, performance, and social freedom. The defining feature of Carnival was the mask. Masked citizens and visitors filled the streets, canals, and public squares. Behind a mask, social distinctions blurred. Nobles could mingle with commoners. Wealthy merchants could move anonymously through crowded gatherings. The masks created an atmosphere of mystery and possibility. Venice became known as a city of intrigue. Masked balls filled palaces. Theatres presented elaborate operas and performances. Gambling houses operated openly, attracting visitors eager to test their luck. The Republic even established one of the world's first legal gambling establishments, the Ridotto, in 1638. Here, aristocrats and travellers gathered to play games of chance beneath glittering chandeliers. Venice also became famous for its courtesans. Unlike ordinary prostitutes, Venetian courtesans were often highly educated women who participated in intellectual and artistic circles. Some were celebrated in poetry and painting. They hosted gatherings where politics, literature, and philosophy were discussed. The city's cultural life flourished. Venice produced extraordinary artists and musicians whose works would define the artistic spirit of the age. Among them was Antonio Vivaldi, the brilliant composer whose energetic violin concertos captured the rhythm and excitement of Venetian life. Vivaldi spent many years teaching music to girls at a Venetian orphanage known as the Ospedale della Pietà. The orchestra formed by these young musicians became famous throughout Europe. Painters such as Canaletto also shaped the world's image of Venice. His detailed landscapes of canals, bridges, and palaces allowed visitors to take home visual memories of the city. These paintings became prized souvenirs for travellers on the Grand Tour, a journey wealthy young Europeans took to complete their education. For these travellers, Venice represented something unique. It was a city of beauty, pleasure, and freedom. But beneath this glittering cultural life, the Republic's political power continued to decline. Its ancient institutions, once admired for their stability, had grown rigid. The oligarchic government struggled to adapt to the rapidly changing political landscape of Europe. By the late 18th century, Venice had become a city that looked backward more than forward. Then, in 1797, the final chapter of the Venetian Republic arrived. A young French general named Napoleon Bonaparte was sweeping across northern Italy with astonishing speed. His revolutionary army defeated Austrian forces and reshaped the political order of the region. Venice tried to remain neutral. For centuries, the Republic had carefully avoided becoming entangled in conflicts between larger powers. But Napoleon had little patience for neutrality. As his armies approached the Lagoon, he accused Venice of secretly supporting his enemies. The Republic faced a terrible dilemma. Its military strength had declined dramatically. The once powerful Venetian fleet was a shadow of its former self. The city had no realistic way to resist Napoleon's experienced army. The Venetian government gathered for one final debate inside the chambers of the Great Council. The decision they faced was heartbreaking. If they resisted Napoleon, the city might be bombarded and destroyed. If they surrendered, the 1,000-year-old Republic would come to an end. On the 12th of May 1797, the decision was made. The Great Council voted to dissolve the Republic of Venice. The last Doge, Ludovico Manin, removed the ceremonial ducal cap from his head and quietly handed it to a servant. According to tradition, he simply said, "I shall not need this again." French troops soon entered St. Mark's Square. For the first time in over 1,000 years, Venice was occupied by a foreign army. The famous bronze horses of St. Mark's Basilica were taken to Paris. The golden state barge, the Bucintaro, was destroyed. The Serenissima, the most serene republic, was gone. Yet Venice itself did not disappear. In the years that followed, the city passed between French and Austrian control before eventually becoming part of the unified Kingdom of Italy in 1866. The Republic was gone, but its legacy remained everywhere. The financial practices developed by Venetian merchants shaped modern banking and accounting. Words like bank, credit, and debit trace their origins to the commercial culture of Italian cities. Even the word quarantine comes from Venetian policy. To protect the city from diseases carried by arriving ships, Venice required vessels to remain isolated for quarantagioni 40 days before entering the harbour. Today, visitors walking through Venice are surrounded by the echoes of its past. St. Mark's Square still opens onto the lagoon like a grand stage. The Doge's palace still stands beside the basilica where the relic of St. Mark rests. The narrow canals still wind through neighbourhoods where merchants, sailors and artisans once lived. Across the Mediterranean, the Lion of Street Mark can still be seen carved into ancient fortresses and harbour walls, silent reminders of the maritime empire Venice once commanded. In the end, the greatest achievement of Venice was not simply its wealth or its power. It was the fact that a community of refugees fleeing invasion and building homes on muddy islands created one of the most extraordinary civilizations in history, a city that should never have existed, and yet endured for 1,000 years.